When autumn leaves started falling, Roman quartermasters got that familiar sinking feeling in their stomachs. Winter was coming, and with it, the logistical nightmare of keeping thousands of soldiers fed when supply lines turned into frozen death traps. The first task was stockpiling enough food to last until spring, which was roughly as fun as it sounds. Roman legions operated on a simple principle: hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And in winter, the worst meant being completely cut off from resupply for months. Each legion needed approximately 7,500 kilograms of grain per day just to keep the troops from gnawing on their shields. Multiply that by 120 days of winter, and you're looking at storing roughly 900,000 kilograms of grain. That's not a granary, that's a grain mountain. The Romans built massive storage facilities called horia near their winter camps, structures so large they could double as indoor sports arenas if sports had been invented yet. These weren't your average storage sheds. Roman horia were architectural marvels designed specifically to preserve food through brutal winters. Raised floors kept grain away from ground moisture and the rats that came with it. Those rodents were the bane of every Roman quartermaster's existence, capable of eating their way through a legion's survival faster than a Germanic ambush. Thick stone walls provided insulation, while ventilation systems prevented the deadly combination of moisture and warmth that turned grain into a moldy disaster. Some horia had heating channels beneath the floors, essentially ancient Roman underfloor heating, because even grain deserved not to freeze solid. The autumn harvest became a military operation in itself. Local populations discovered the joy of contributing to the Roman war effort, which is a polite way of saying the legions took what they needed and left IOUs that were about as valuable as thoughts and prayers. Soldiers fanned out across the countryside, requisitioning grain, vegetables, and livestock with the efficiency of locusts in uniform. But unlike actual locusts, they at least kept records. Roman bureaucracy meant that somewhere some poor scribe was documenting exactly how many chickens got voluntarily donated to the 13th Legion. Livestock posed a special challenge. You couldn't exactly stack cattle in a warehouse like sacks of wheat. Instead, the Romans developed portable storage solutions, also known as keeping the animals alive until you needed to eat them. This required gathering enough fodder to feed herds through winter, which meant storing almost as much animal food as human food. Cattle, pigs, and sheep were kept in enclosures near the camps, creating a mobile meat locker that occasionally mooed. The animals provided fresh meat throughout winter, and their body heat actually warmed nearby storage areas. Those Romans never wasted an opportunity for efficiency, even if it meant their food supply doubles as a heating system. Salt became as precious as gold during these preparations. Without refrigeration, salt was the only thing standing between fresh meat and rotten garbage. The Romans stockpiled enormous quantities of salt specifically for winter food preservation. They salted pork, beef, and fish with the dedication of people who really didn't want to die of food poisoning in a frozen wasteland. Some legions stationed near coastal areas had it easier, with access to salt production facilities. Others had to transport salt over hundreds of kilometers, adding yet another item to their impossibly long logistics list. With their warehouses bursting and livestock secured, the legions faced their next winter challenge, making sure none of this food killed them before the enemy did. The average Roman legionary in winter received rations that were designed for one primary purpose: keeping him functional enough to march, fight, and not mutiny. Nutrition science hadn't been invented yet, but centuries of trial and error had taught the Romans which foods kept soldiers alive versus which foods turned them into frozen corpses. The daily ration was surprisingly standardized, proving that even in ancient times, the military loved its routines. Each soldier received roughly 800 grams of grain per day, mostly wheat, but also barley when wheat wasn't available. That's about 2 modern loaves of bread worth of grain, which sounds generous until you remember these men were expected to march 30 kilometers in full armor while carrying 40 kilograms of equipment. The grain wasn't handed out as fluffy baguettes either. Soldiers received it raw and had to process it themselves, because apparently being a highly trained killing machine wasn't enough without also being your own baker. Groups of 8 soldiers, called contubernium, shared a tent and pooled their rations. This wasn't just about fostering friendship, though that was a nice side benefit. It was practical efficiency. 8 men could maintain a small hand mill for grinding grain into flour, share the work of baking bread, and keep a cooking fire going more efficiently than individuals. Plus, it meant that when one guy burned the bread, 7 others were there to remind him of his failure for the rest of the campaign. Nothing builds unit cohesion quite like shared culinary disasters. The bread they made was dense, heavy, and about as appetizing as you'd expect from something baked by sleep-deprived soldiers in sub-zero temperatures. But it was calories, and in winter, calories were survival. Some units added crushed lentils or beans to their bread dough, creating a proto-protein bar that tasted like sadness but provided more sustained energy. The Romans called this panis militaris, military bread, which is about as creative as calling a sword a sharp metal stick. It kept for weeks when stored properly, making it perfect for winter when fresh baking wasn't always possible. Beyond bread, soldiers received a monthly allowance of other foods. Bacon fat, or lard, was distributed regularly because fat equals warmth, and warmth equals not dying. A tablespoon of lard added to morning porridge could raise a soldier's body temperature enough to make the difference between functional and frostbitten. The Romans weren't squeamish about fat the way modern diets are. They understood that in freezing conditions, fat was liquid survival. Some soldiers would eat chunks of bacon fat straight, which sounds disgusting until you've spent 3 hours standing guard in a Germanic blizzard. Legionaries also received vinegar, which they mixed with water to create posca, the ancient Roman energy drink. This sour beverage sounds revolting but served multiple purposes. The acidity killed bacteria in questionable water sources, making it safer to drink than straight water from streams or melted snow. It provided a tiny bit of flavor in an otherwise monotonous diet. And the acetic acid gave a small energy boost, much like modern sour candies that athletes consume. Soldiers drank posca throughout the day, and in winter they often heated it, creating history's least appealing hot beverage. But it worked, and in the Roman military, working was more important than tasting good. Vegetables were the wild card in winter rations. Fresh vegetables disappeared pretty quickly after the first hard freeze, but the Romans had workarounds. They pickled everything they could get their hands on before winter. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and various roots got preserved in brine. These fermented vegetables weren't just about adding variety, although the soldiers certainly appreciated anything that wasn't bread or bacon. Fermented foods provided essential vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which prevented scurvy. The Romans didn't know about vitamins, but they knew that legions eating pickled vegetables stayed healthier than those who didn't. Sometimes practical observation beats scientific understanding. Dried legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and beans formed a crucial part of winter nutrition. These kept indefinitely when stored dry and provided protein when meat was scarce. Soldiers boiled them into thick soups and stews, often mixing in whatever else was available, bits of salted meat, wild onions, or foraged herbs. These one-pot meals were efficient, using minimal fuel while feeding an entire tent group. The resulting stew probably tasted like boiled leather seasoned with despair, but it filled stomachs and provided the nutrients needed to survive another day of winter garrison duty. Cheese provided another source of preserved nutrition. Hard cheeses could last months without refrigeration, and the Romans produced enormous quantities specifically for military use. Cheese provided concentrated calories and protein in a portable form. Soldiers could carry chunks of cheese in their packs, gnawing on them during marches or night watches. Some legions stationed in dairy-rich regions accumulated massive cheese reserves. One Roman fortress in modern-day England had cheese storage capable of holding over 30,000 kilograms, enough to give every soldier approximately 6 kilograms of cheese. That's either impressive logistics or a dairy nightmare, depending on your lactose tolerance. The question of alcohol in winter rations deserves special mention. Roman soldiers received wine as part of their standard rations, though the winter vintage was usually whatever cheap plunk could be transported in bulk. This wasn't about getting the troops drunk, contrary to what you might assume about ancient armies. Wine served practical purposes. Mixed with water, it made questionable water sources safer to drink. It provided warmth, or at least the illusion of it, which helped with morale during freezing nights. And a small amount of alcohol actually did provide a few calories and helped soldiers sleep despite the cold. The ration was controlled, enough to be useful but not enough to turn the legion into a stumbling disaster. Well, most of the time. With these basic rations secured, the legion still faced the challenge of actually cooking food when everything outside was trying to freeze solid. Cooking food in a Roman winter camp was an exercise in controlled chaos. You needed fire hot enough to bake bread and boil stew, but not so large it consumed all your carefully stockpiled firewood in the first month of winter. You needed to cook indoors to avoid freezing, but not set your wooden barracks on fire. And you needed to do all this while maintaining military discipline, which meant no stealing your tent mate's bread, even if yours burned to an inedible brick. The Romans developed specific systems for winter cooking that balanced efficiency, safety, and the reality of having thousands of cold, hungry soldiers. Each contubernium had its own cooking area, usually a stone hearth built into or immediately adjacent to their barracks. These weren't fancy kitchen setups. Think more pile of rocks with a fire on top than rustic Italian villa. But they worked, and working was the Roman engineering standard. The hearths were designed to channel heat efficiently, with stone or clay structures that retained warmth and directed smoke away from living spaces. Well, theoretically directed smoke away. In practice, Roman barracks in winter were probably smokier than a modern hookah bar, but at least everyone had warm, cooked food. Firewood became a currency as valuable as gold in winter camps. A legion could burn through several tons of wood per day just for cooking and heating. Before winter hit, soldiers spent countless hours gathering, chopping, and stacking firewood. Forests near Roman winter camps got systematically cleared, creating deforested zones that actually served defensive purposes. It's hard to ambush a fort when all the trees for a kilometer around have been turned into cooking fuel. Roman logistics officers calculated firewood needs with the same precision they applied to grain rations. Some winter camps had dedicated wood-cutting details that operated throughout the season, constantly replenishing supplies. The Romans became masters of fuel-efficient cooking. Slow-burning hardwoods were saved for overnight heating, while faster-burning woods were used for quick cooking fires. Some camps used charcoal, which burned hotter and cleaner than wood, though producing charcoal required additional labor and resources. In regions where wood was scarce, the Romans weren't above using dried dung as fuel, proving once again that dignity took a back seat to survival. Cow dung burns surprisingly well when properly dried, and soldiers stationed in treeless regions learned to appreciate it. As one soldier might have joked, when you're freezing your ass off in Britannia, you'll burn anything that produces heat, including your dignity. Communal ovens served larger groups, particularly for baking bread in bulk. These substantial stone structures could bake dozens of loaves simultaneously, making them far more efficient than individual hearth baking. A legion would have multiple communal ovens operating throughout winter, filling camps with the smell of fresh bread, or at least bread-adjacent substances that soldiers could chew without breaking teeth. These ovens were heated to extreme temperatures, then the fire was removed and bread inserted into the retained heat. This technique, still used in some traditional bakeries, maximized fuel efficiency while producing consistently cooked bread. The actual process of winter cooking required adaptations to frozen ingredients. Soldiers couldn't exactly grab a handful of grain from a sack when that grain had frozen into a solid block. Storage areas needed to maintain temperatures above freezing, which meant some heating in the horea themselves. Water froze solid in containers, requiring soldiers to melt snow or ice before cooking. Smart units kept large pots of water simmering constantly, ensuring a supply of liquid water was always available. This used extra fuel but saved enormous time and effort. Cooking techniques favored one-pot meals that maximized warmth and minimized cleanup. Thick stews combining grain, legumes, preserved meat, and any available vegetables became the winter standard. These meals cooked slowly throughout the day, allowing soldiers on duty to return to hot food whenever their shifts ended. The constant simmering also kept the cooking fire going, warming the barracks. It was efficient multitasking. Dinner doubled as a space heater. Some of these stews probably simmered for days, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed, creating perpetual stews that would horrify modern food safety inspectors, but kept Roman soldiers fed. Portable cooking equipment allowed soldiers on patrol or campaign to prepare food away from the main camp. Each contubernium had cooking pots, pans, and utensils that could be packed and transported. These weren't gourmet kitchen sets, more like functional metal containers that won't kill you with poisoning level equipment. But soldiers could set up temporary camps, gather local firewood, and prepare basic meals using their rations and whatever they could forage. This flexibility meant Roman legions remained mobile even in winter, not tied to fixed camps for every meal. Winter supply convoys were serious operations requiring significant military escorts. Moving food across hostile or harsh territory attracted every bandit, desperate local, and opportunistic enemy within raiding distance. A supply convoy was basically a mobile feast, and everyone wanted an invitation. Roman supply trains traveled with armed guards, scouts, and sometimes entire cohorts assigned as protection. The irony of using soldiers to protect food for soldiers wasn't lost on anyone, but without those guards, supply convoys simply didn't arrive. Some supply missions lost more men to combat than the garrisons they were resupplying. Rivers presented both obstacles and opportunities in winter. When frozen solid, rivers became highways, allowing supplies to move directly across terrain that was impassable in summer. The Romans became experts at judging ice thickness, determining when frozen rivers could support laden wagons. This wasn't guesswork. Roman engineers measured ice depth systematically, and commanders followed established guidelines about weight limits. Still, every winter, some unfortunate supply convoy discovered their calculations were slightly optimistic, usually resulting in several tons of grain at the bottom of a river and some very awkward reports to headquarters. Sledges replaced wheeled carts in deep snow. These simple but effective devices distributed weight more evenly, preventing vehicles from sinking into soft snow. Roman supply sledges could carry impressive loads, pulled by oxen or horses equipped with special winter gear. Some sledges were massive affairs requiring teams of animals, while others were human portable for smaller loads. The Roman military supply system included specifications for sledge construction, ensuring standardized equipment across different legions, because even in ancient times, the military loved its standardized equipment lists. Some winter garrisons were so isolated that regular resupply became impossible once serious snow fell. These outposts relied entirely on stockpiled supplies and local resources. Commanders of these isolated forts became masters of resource management, calculating daily rations with mathematical precision to ensure supplies lasted until spring thaw. Running out of food in an isolated winter fort was a death sentence, and every commander knew it. Some reduced rations slightly across the entire winter rather than risk shortages. Soldiers grumbled about smaller portions, but they grumbled less than they would have about starving. The Cursus Publicus, Rome's official courier and transport system, maintained limited winter operations in frontier regions. This impressive logistics network normally moved messages, officials, and small cargo across the empire with impressive speed. In winter, it operated on reduced schedules but continued functioning, carrying critical communications and priority supplies. Medical supplies, replacement equipment, and urgent orders moved through the Cursus Publicus even when bulk food transport halted. Some stations maintained heated waypoints where couriers could warm themselves and change horses, essentially ancient truck stops minus the questionable coffee. Local requisitioning intensified during winter, when long-distance supply became difficult. Roman legions weren't shy about acquiring food from nearby settlements. This usually happened through official channels, with requisition orders and compensation promises. Sometimes it happened through less official channels, which is a polite way of saying soldiers took what they needed and apologized later. Frontier populations learned to hide their best food stores when Roman supply officers came calling. Not that it helped much. Roman soldiers were very good at finding hidden food, a skill developed through centuries of practice and motivated by the powerful incentive of not starving. Some legions established satellite supply caches at strategic points between major bases and forward positions. These hidden stockpiles provided emergency reserves if primary supply lines failed. The locations were kept secret, marked only on official maps held by senior officers. These caches typically contained long-lasting foods, dried grain, salted meat, and hardtack-style preserved bread. They weren't meant for regular use, only desperate situations. But their existence provided insurance against the worst-case scenarios that kept commanders awake at night. Despite all this planning, sometimes supply lines failed completely, forcing legions to solve the food problem with more creative approaches. When supply lines failed or rations ran low, Roman legions fell back on humanity's oldest food acquisition strategy: finding it yourself. Winter foraging wasn't as productive as summer gathering, but soldiers who knew what to look for could supplement rations significantly. The Roman military actively trained soldiers in foraging skills, recognizing that survival sometimes depended on knowing which frozen plants were edible versus which ones would kill you in creative and unpleasant ways. Winter hunting became both sport and necessity in frontier regions. Germanic forests, British highlands, and Balkan mountains contained abundant game even in cold months. Deer, boar, and various birds provided fresh meat to supplement preserved rations. Roman soldiers were already trained with javelins and bows for combat, so hunting became a practical extension of military skills. Some legions organized formal hunting parties, detailed groups of soldiers tasked with bringing back meat for their units. These expeditions served multiple purposes: providing food, maintaining combat skills, and giving bored soldiers something to do besides complain about the cold. Not all hunting was large game. Rabbits, hares, and various rodents supplemented diet during lean times. They weren't glamorous catches, but a rabbit stew fed a conturbinium, and 8 fed men didn't care if their protein came from a majestic stag or a common hare. Soldiers set snares and traps near camps, passive hunting methods that required minimal effort while potentially providing steady returns. Some enterprising soldiers became quite skilled trappers, earning extra income by trading surplus catches to other units or locals. The Roman military economy ran on such informal arrangements, creating shadow markets wherever legions gathered. Fish and other aquatic food sources remained available even in winter. Ice fishing became common in frozen regions, with soldiers cutting holes through ice to access fish below. This wasn't the peaceful hobby it might sound like. It was cold, miserable work that occasionally resulted in soldiers falling through ice. But fish provided protein without depleting livestock reserves, making the effort worthwhile. Rivers too fast to freeze completely offered year-round fishing opportunities. Some camps near major rivers had permanent fishing details, soldiers whose primary duty was catching fish for the legion. It beat digging latrines in frozen ground, so it wasn't the worst assignment. Not all hunting was large game. Rabbits, hares, and various rodents supplemented diet during lean times. They weren't glamorous catches, but a rabbit stew fed a contumbernium, and 8 fed men didn't care if their protein came from a majestic stag or a common hare. Soldiers set snares and traps near camps, passive hunting methods that required minimal effort while potentially providing steady returns. Some enterprising soldiers became quite skilled trappers, earning extra income by trading surplus catches to other units or locals. The Roman military economy ran on such informal arrangements, creating shadow markets wherever legions gathered. Edible plants persisted through winter for those who knew where to look. Evergreen tips, certain bark varieties, wild onions, and various roots remained nutritious even after frost. Roman soldiers stationed for multiple winters in the same region learned which local plants were safe and valuable. This knowledge often came from locals, either through friendly exchange or less friendly interrogation. Some legions compiled informal guides to local edible plants passed down through generations of soldiers. These ancient field manuals would fascinate modern foragers, assuming they could decipher the creative Latin spelling of soldiers with varying literacy levels. Stored autumn harvests from wild plants supplemented winter rations. Before winter hit, smart units gathered nuts, acorns, berries, and other wild foods in quantities sufficient to make a difference. Acorns particularly deserved mention. While bitter and requiring processing to remove tannins, acorns provided substantial calories. Roman soldiers learned to leach acorns by soaking them in cold water, a time-consuming process but worth the effort when grain supplies ran low. Some commanders mandated autumn foraging quotas, requiring each soldier to gather set amounts of wild food before winter. It built emergency reserves while keeping troops active during the transition season. Beekeeping and honey collection provided both food and medicine. Honey never spoiled, making it perfect for long-term storage. Beyond sweetening terrible-tasting rations, honey had medicinal properties used to treat wounds and illnesses. Some Roman camps maintained beehives specifically for honey production. Winter was actually ideal for collecting stored honey, as bees were less active in cold weather. Soldiers who knew how to handle bees safely became valuable assets. Others just enjoyed watching from a safe distance as someone else got stung while raiding hives for sweet, golden treasure. Opportunistic gathering continued throughout winter. Soldiers on patrol or guard duty collected edible items they encountered. Frozen berries still on bushes, birds' eggs from winter nests, even edible moss and lichens that grew on trees. None of these sources provided substantial calories alone, but combined they could meaningfully supplement rations. The Roman military encouraged this low-level foraging, recognizing that every bit of wild food meant rations stretched further. Some soldiers became remarkably knowledgeable about edible wild resources, sharing information throughout their units. Yet foraging and hunting couldn't fully replace proper supply systems, pushing the Romans to develop more reliable winter food sources. The Romans weren't content to simply endure winter. They developed techniques to actively grow food during cold months, pushing agricultural boundaries in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. This wasn't universal. Fresh vegetables in February weren't standard across every frozen frontier fort. But in strategic locations, particularly near permanent bases and important cities, the Romans created winter growing systems that kept supplying fresh food when nature said production should stop. The specularia, or Roman greenhouse, represented ancient engineering at its most practical. These structures used thin sheets of translucent stone, usually mica or selenite, to create enclosed growing spaces that trapped solar heat. The concept was brilliantly simple: create a barrier that lets light through while keeping cold air out. Roman agronomist Columella described these structures in detail, explaining how they allowed growing vegetables even during winter. The Emperor Tiberius supposedly demanded cucumbers year-round, forcing his gardeners to develop specularia specifically to meet this imperial cucumber obsession. History doesn't record what the gardeners thought about the emperor's vegetable priorities, but they made it work. These early greenhouses weren't massive glass structures like modern equivalents. Think smaller, more like individual cold frames that covered raised beds. But they worked surprisingly well. Inside a specularia, temperatures could be 10 to 15 degrees warmer than outside, enough to keep cold-hardy vegetables growing through winter. The structures required regular maintenance, cleaning the translucent covers to maintain light transmission, and repairing any breaks that let cold air inside. But the payoff was fresh vegetables when everything outside was frozen solid. Some military camps near major stone quarries built multiple specularia, creating small-scale winter farms. Heated growing beds took the concept further. The Romans developed hypocaust heating systems, normally used for baths and wealthy homes, for agricultural purposes. Hot air circulated through underground channels beneath planting beds, keeping soil temperatures warm enough for growth. This was expensive and labor-intensive, requiring constant fires to maintain heat. Only the most important military bases or wealthy estates bothered with heated growing beds, but where they existed, they produced fresh vegetables throughout winter. Lettuce, radishes, and various herbs grew successfully in these artificially warmed environments. It was ancient climate control dedicated to salad production, which shows impressive priorities. Cave farming utilized natural underground spaces that maintained relatively constant temperatures year-round. The Romans knew that deep caves never froze, staying roughly the same temperature regardless of surface conditions. Some creative military food producers used caves to grow mushrooms and certain shade-tolerant plants. This wasn't large-scale production, but supplemental. A cave producing fresh mushrooms weekly might not feed a legion, but it added variety to officers' meals and provided nutritional benefits. Some caves had underground streams, providing water without needing to melt snow. These subterranean farms were basically ancient bunker gardens, minus the apocalypse scenario. Forcing techniques brought spring harvests forward by weeks or months. Romans discovered that certain plants could be fooled into early growth by manipulating their environment. Bulbs like onions and garlic planted in protected sunny locations would sprout earlier than those in open fields. Trees could be encouraged to break dormancy sooner through careful watering and placement near warm structures. This wasn't genetic modification or even particularly advanced botany. It was careful observation and environmental manipulation. But it worked, providing fresh food before natural spring arrived. Sprouting grains and legumes for fresh greens continued through winter. This ancient version of microgreens required no soil, just water and containers. Soldiers could sprout grain in their own barracks, creating fresh, vitamin-rich greens in less than a week. The process was simple enough that individual soldiers did it regularly. Sprouted grain provided nutrients that were lacking in preserved foods, particularly vitamin C. The Romans didn't know about vitamins, but they knew that soldiers eating sprouts stayed healthier. That practical knowledge saved countless lives from scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Dung hills and compost heaps generated significant heat through decomposition, reaching internal temperatures well above freezing even in winter. Savvy gardeners planted cold, hardy vegetables directly into or around these decomposing piles. The combination of warmth and abundant nutrients created productive microenvironments. This technique required managing the compost carefully to prevent burning plants with excessive heat or harmful compounds. But done right, a properly managed dung heap could produce vegetables through winter. It gave entirely new meaning to the phrase, "food growing out of shit," which Roman soldiers probably appreciated as both practical wisdom and juvenile humor. Some military gardens used south-facing walls as thermal mass and wind protection. Stone or brick walls absorbed solar heat during the day and radiated it at night, creating warmer microclimates. Vegetables planted against these walls, especially those facing south for maximum sun exposure, survived conditions that would kill plants in open ground. Roman military architects intentionally incorporated garden spaces into fort designs, positioning walls and buildings to create protected growing areas. These weren't ornamental gardens, they were functional food production zones integrated into defensive structures. Because why waste a good wall when it could grow your dinner? Winter vegetable production in Roman times was never going to replace bulk grain supplies or feed entire legions, but it provided crucial nutritional diversity and fresh food when stored provisions became monotonous or nutritionally insufficient. Officers particularly benefited from winter gardens, maintaining better diets than common soldiers. This wasn't entirely unfair favoritism. Healthy officers made better decisions, keeping entire units alive. Still, soldiers certainly noticed when centurions enjoyed fresh salad while they chewed dry bread, creating the ancient version of cafeteria inequality. Even with innovative growing techniques, the bulk of winter nutrition still came from preserved foods, requiring sophisticated storage and preparation methods. Keeping food edible for months without refrigeration wasn't just difficult, it was the difference between a surviving legion and a starving one. The Romans developed preservation techniques that modern food scientists would recognize and respect. These methods weren't perfect, spoilage and food poisoning still happened, but they worked well enough to keep Roman armies fed through countless winters across hostile territories. Salt preservation remained the backbone of Roman food storage. Salt drew moisture from meat and fish, creating environments where bacteria couldn't survive. The Romans salted pork with almost religious dedication, creating preserved meat that could last a year or more when stored properly. The process required massive quantities of salt, driving significant Roman economic activity around salt production and trade. Coastal military bases had distinct advantages, with easier access to sea salt. Inland legions needed to import salt over long distances, making it expensive and precious. Soldiers guarded salt supplies as carefully as gold, for good reason. Without salt, winter meat preservation was nearly impossible. The salting process itself was systematic and thorough. Fresh meat was butchered into manageable pieces, then packed in alternating layers with coarse salt. The salt pulled moisture from the meat through osmosis, creating brine that further protected against spoilage. After weeks of salt curing, the meat was removed, rinsed, and sometimes smoked for additional preservation. The result was intensely salty, tough, and not particularly delicious, but it was stable and nutritious. Soldiers soaked salted meat in water before cooking, removing some salt while rehydrating the dried flesh. The end product still tasted like ocean-flavored leather, but you could chew it and extract calories, which was the point. Drying removed moisture that bacteria needed to grow. Dried fruits, vegetables, and even meat strips could last months when kept dry. The Romans dried food in the sun during summer and autumn, then stored the desiccated results in sealed containers for winter use. Dried legumes, beans and lentils, were staples precisely because they kept indefinitely. A bag of dried chickpeas from 3 years ago was just as nutritious as fresh dried ones. This made them perfect for military logistics. Dried fruit provided concentrated sugars and vitamins. Soldiers carried dried fruit on campaigns, eating it as trail food that wouldn't spoil regardless of conditions. Honey served both as food and preservative. Its high sugar content and low moisture created environments where bacteria couldn't survive. Romans preserved fruits and some meats in honey, creating sweet preserved foods that kept for years. Honey-preserved foods were expensive, reserved for officers or medical use, rather than standard soldier rations. But their preservation properties were remarkable. Archaeological excavations have found Roman honey that's still technically edible after 2,000 years, which is either fascinating or horrifying depending on your perspective on ancient food consumption. Oil preservation worked for vegetables and fish. Submerging food in olive oil excluded oxygen, preventing spoilage. The Romans packed vegetables, cheese, and fish in oil-filled amphorae, creating preserved foods that maintained quality for months. This technique was more common in Mediterranean regions where olive oil was abundant. Smoking meat and fish added another preservation layer. Smoke contained chemicals that inhibited bacterial growth while adding distinctive flavors that made preserved food more palatable. Roman military camps often had dedicated smokehouses, structures where meat hung over slow-burning fires for days or weeks. The combination of smoke exposure and low heat gradually dried meat while infusing preservative compounds. Smoked and salted meat together provided excellent long-term preservation. Some examples could last 2 years or more, though the taste probably degraded to technically edible well before then. Fermentation preserved vegetables and dairy products through controlled bacterial action. Roman soldiers consumed fermented cabbage, an ancient predecessor to modern sauerkraut that kept for months while actually improving in flavor. The fermentation process created acidic environments hostile to harmful bacteria while preserving nutrients, particularly vitamin C. Soldiers who regularly ate fermented vegetables avoided scurvy, though they had no idea why. They just knew it worked. Fermented fish sauce, garum, provided intense flavoring and long-lasting protein. This pungent condiment was basically liquid umami that never spoiled. Modern people would probably find it revolting, but Roman soldiers used it on everything. Northern frontier legions rarely had enough oil for preservation, needing to import it at great expense. But when available, oil preservation produced foods that retained more flavor and texture than dried or salted equivalents. Vinegar pickling preserved vegetables through acidity. The Romans pickled everything from cucumbers to onions to strange things modern people wouldn't consider pickle-worthy. The acidic environment killed bacteria and preserved texture surprisingly well. Pickled vegetables provided crucial vitamins in winter diets, preventing deficiency diseases. They also added intense flavors to monotonous rations. A piece of pickled turnip wasn't exactly gourmet cuisine, but it broke up the tedium of endless grain porridge. Soldiers developed strong preferences for specific pickled items, creating informal trading markets within camps. Proper storage required careful attention. Preserved foods needed to be kept cool and dry. Roman Horea maintained these conditions through architectural design, but storing food in soldiers' quarters was trickier. Each conturbenium had responsibility for their rations, storing them in sealed containers that protected against moisture and pests. Regular inspection ensured spoilage was caught early. Spoiled food wasn't just wasted, it was dangerous. Food poisoning could incapacitate soldiers as effectively as combat. Officers conducted random inspections of food stores, checking for signs of rot or infestation. Soldiers found with spoiled rations faced punishment, incentivizing proper food care. The art of determining whether preserved food was still safe to eat was passed down through experience. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs of dangerous spoilage versus harmless aging. Strange smells, unusual colors, or slimy textures all indicated problems. When in doubt, soldiers fed questionable food to dogs first. If the dog survived, the food was probably safe. If not, well, better one dead dog than 8 dead soldiers. This wasn't kind to the dogs, but ancient Roman military ethics had different priorities than modern animal welfare standards. Despite all these preservation techniques, food eventually spoiled, creating another winter challenge that tested Roman ingenuity and discipline. Sometimes things went wrong. Not every winter went according to plan. Supply convoys got ambushed, storage buildings caught fire, unexpected cold snaps lasted longer than anticipated, and sometimes the harvest before winter simply failed. When food crises hit, Roman commanders faced choices that ranged from difficult to nightmare-inducing. How they handled these situations often determined whether their legions survived the winter or ended up as cautionary tales in military textbooks. Rationing became the first response to food shortages. Roman commanders could reduce daily rations systematically, calculating exactly how long remaining supplies would last at reduced consumption levels. This wasn't popular. Hungry soldiers were miserable soldiers, more prone to illness, less effective in combat, and significantly more likely to mutiny. But starving soldiers were dead soldiers, so rationing was the lesser evil. The math was brutally simple. Better everyone suffers equally at reduced rations than some eat normally while others starve. Officers enforced ration discipline harshly because the alternative was chaos. The Roman military hierarchy showed clearly during rationing. Officers typically maintained better rations than common soldiers, justified by their need to remain mentally sharp for decision-making. This created obvious resentment. Soldiers watching their centurion eat relatively well while they gnawed on minimal bread developed strong opinions about leadership priorities. Smart commanders ate publicly at the same reduced rations as their troops, building morale through shared suffering. Cannibalism represented the absolute breakdown of military order and civilization. Roman sources mention it rarely and with obvious horror, but it happened during the most desperate sieges and famines. When all other food sources were exhausted and death was imminent, some starving people ate the dead. The Romans viewed this as the ultimate taboo, evidence of complete social collapse. Military discipline usually prevented it through systematic rationing and harsh punishment for any who violated food-sharing rules. But in a handful of documented cases, Roman forces or besieged populations crossed this line. These incidents were remembered as shameful disasters, lessons in what happened when logistics failed completely. Trading with enemies sometimes became necessary during severe shortages. This created awkward situations where Roman legions negotiated food purchases from the very people they were supposed to be fighting. Germanic tribes, Dacian warriors, or Parthian merchants would sell food to Romans at inflated prices, recognizing desperation when they saw it. Pride took a back seat to survival. A legion that maintained its honor while starving to death was just a dead legion with good reputation. Pragmatic commanders swallowed their pride and made deals. Other times, temporary truces emerged where both sides needed to survive winter before resuming hostilities in spring. Relief convoys became desperate priority missions during food crises. When news reached headquarters that a legion was starving, every available resource went toward emergency resupply. These missions accepted higher risks, traveling in worse weather and fighting through hostile territory. The political and military costs of losing an entire legion to starvation exceeded almost any other consideration. Less smart commanders enjoyed their privileges and dealt with discipline problems. The best leaders found middle ground, taking slightly reduced rations that showed solidarity while maintaining enough nutrition to function effectively. Foraging intensified dramatically during food crises. Commanders sent out larger parties to scour wider areas for anything edible. These desperate foraging missions sometimes ventured into dangerous territories, accepting combat risk as preferable to starvation. Soldiers stripped bark from trees, dug for roots in frozen ground, and hunted animals they'd normally ignore. When regular food sources were exhausted, Romans ate things that would horrify modern sensibilities. Leather from equipment could be boiled into a nutritious if disgusting soup. Horses and pack animals, normally too valuable to slaughter, became emergency protein. The line between "we're managing the crisis" and "we're eating our boots" was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Requisitioning from locals became increasingly aggressive during shortages. What started as official procurement with promised compensation transformed into barely disguised theft. Local populations hid food more desperately while Roman soldiers searched more thoroughly. This created vicious cycles where locals resisted more strongly, Romans responded more harshly, and relationships deteriorated rapidly. Some frontier populations openly rebelled when Roman requisitioning left them facing starvation. From the Roman perspective, they needed food to survive and protect the empire's borders. From the local perspective, an occupying army was stealing their winter supplies. Both views were valid, and neither resolved the fundamental problem of insufficient food. Some relief missions became legendary examples of Roman determination, fighting through blizzards and ambushes to deliver food to dying garrisons. Others failed, their frozen bodies discovered in spring along with the supplies they'd tried to deliver. Disease inevitably followed malnutrition. Malnourished soldiers had weakened immune systems, making them vulnerable to every infection circulating through crowded winter quarters. What started as a food shortage quickly cascaded into a medical crisis. Roman military medicine was relatively advanced for its time, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of starving patients. Diseases that healthy soldiers would survive killed malnourished ones. Medical officers during food crises faced impossible triage decisions, determining who received limited medical supplies and food supplements. These decisions haunted them long after winter ended. Mutiny was the nightmare scenario commanders feared during food crises. Starving soldiers had nothing left to lose. If they believed their leadership had failed them, or worse, was hoarding food while they starved, violence could erupt. Roman military discipline was normally ironclad, maintained through brutal punishments for disobedience. But hungry men with weapons were inherently dangerous, regardless of discipline. Historical records document several mutinies triggered by food shortages, where legions turned on their officers or refused orders. Cannibalism represented the absolute breakdown of military order and civilization. Roman sources mention it rarely and with obvious horror, but it happened during the most desperate sieges and famines. When all other food sources were exhausted and death was imminent, some starving people ate the dead. The Romans viewed this as the ultimate taboo, evidence of complete social collapse. Military discipline usually prevented it through systematic rationing and harsh punishment for any who violated food-sharing rules. But in a handful of documented cases, Roman forces or besieged populations crossed this line. These incidents were remembered as shameful disasters, lessons in what happened when logistics failed completely. Trading with enemies sometimes became necessary during severe shortages. This created awkward situations where Roman legions negotiated food purchases from the very people they were supposed to be fighting. Germanic tribes, Dacian warriors, or Parthian merchants would sell food to Romans at inflated prices, recognizing desperation when they saw it. Pride took a back seat to survival. A legion that maintained its honor while starving to death was just a dead legion with good reputation. Pragmatic commanders swallowed their pride and made deals. Other times, temporary truces emerged where both sides needed to survive winter before resuming hostilities in spring. Relief convoys became desperate priority missions during food crises. When news reached headquarters that a legion was starving, every available resource went toward emergency resupply. These missions accepted higher risks, traveling in worse weather and fighting through hostile territory. The political and military costs of losing an entire legion to starvation exceeded almost any other consideration. These situations rarely ended well for anyone involved. Successful commanders prevented mutiny through transparent rationing, sharing suffering visibly, and maintaining hope that relief was coming. Psychological warfare around food became common when Romans faced extended sieges or campaigns. Enemies who knew Romans were short on supplies would deliberately flaunt their own food abundance, trying to break morale. Romans did the same when situations reversed, ostentatiously displaying full storehouses to intimidate besieging forces. These displays weren't always honest. Sometimes armies on the verge of starvation staged elaborate shows of plenty, hoping to convince enemies they could hold out indefinitely. Other times they were honest assessments that this siege would last as long as necessary because the defenders had years of food. When winter ended and spring came, lessons learned from food crises influenced military planning for the next year. Commanders who'd nearly lost legions to starvation became obsessive about food stockpiling. Logistics officers whose convoys failed learned from mistakes. The Roman military institutional memory preserved these lessons, spreading successful strategies and cautionary tales throughout the army. Every disaster taught the next generation how to avoid repeating it, assuming anyone survived to pass on the knowledge. With the harsh realities of food crises understood, the Romans developed sophisticated medical knowledge about nutrition and winter health. Roman military medicine understood connections between diet and health that wouldn't be scientifically explained for centuries. They didn't know about vitamins, bacteria, or the biochemical processes underlying nutrition, but they knew through centuries of observation which foods kept soldiers healthy and which deficiencies caused specific diseases. This practical knowledge saved countless lives during winter when poor nutrition combined with harsh conditions to create perfect disease conditions. Scurvy was the silent killer of winter garrisons. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, weakened connective tissues, made wounds fail to heal, caused teeth to fall out, and eventually killed. The Romans didn't understand the underlying cause, but they knew which foods prevented it. Fermented vegetables, particularly the sauerkraut-like preparations stored in barrels, kept soldiers healthy when fresh fruits and vegetables weren't available. Pine needle tea, tasting terrible but rich in vitamin C, became a folk remedy in northern regions. Soldiers who maintained these dietary habits avoided scurvy, while those who didn't suffered and died in predictable patterns. Night blindness indicated vitamin A deficiency, something Romans recognized even without understanding the mechanism. Liver, particularly from game animals hunted in winter, provided concentrated vitamin A. Military medical officers prescribed liver consumption for soldiers showing early signs of vision problems. This wasn't random superstition, it was effective medical practice based on observed results. Soldiers who ate liver regularly maintained better night vision, crucial for winter guard duties when darkness lasted 18 hours or more. The treatment worked, validating the practice even without scientific explanation. Anemia from iron deficiency weakened soldiers insidiously. The Romans recognized the symptoms: weakness, pale skin, and difficulty performing physical tasks, and had treatments. Red meat, particularly organ meats like spleen and heart, provided concentrated iron. Legions maintained livestock partially to ensure availability of fresh meat for soldiers showing anemia symptoms. Additionally, cooking in iron pots leached small amounts of iron into food, providing supplemental intake. This wasn't intentional iron supplementation in the modern sense, but the effect was the same. Soldiers who ate from iron cookware consistently had better iron levels than those using ceramic pots. Digestive problems plagued winter camps where sanitation and food quality were challenged. Roman military medicine used various herbs and preparations to treat intestinal issues. Wormwood, mint, and chamomile teas soothed digestive complaints. Modern analysis shows these plants contain compounds with genuine antiparasitic and anti-inflammatory properties. The Romans didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the herbs worked. Military medical gardens, even small winter versions, maintained these medicinal plants. Some could be grown in protected indoor spaces, ensuring availability throughout winter. Wounds and injuries healed more slowly in winter, complicated by malnutrition and poor conditions. Roman military surgeons understood that well-fed soldiers healed faster than malnourished ones. Injured soldiers received supplemental rations, additional protein and fats to support healing. This wasn't compassion, it was practical medicine. A soldier who recovered quickly returned to duty, while one who healed slowly or died was a permanent loss. The investment of extra food in injured soldiers provided clear returns. Honey was applied to wounds as both antibacterial agent and healing promoter. Modern medicine has confirmed honey's medical properties, validating ancient Roman practice. Frostbite and cold injuries required immediate treatment and prevention. Roman military medicine recognized that proper nutrition improved cold tolerance. Soldiers eating adequate fats handled cold exposure better than those on low-fat diets. This observation led to ensuring winter rations included sufficient lard and bacon fat. Additionally, hot food and drinks were considered medical necessities, not luxuries. Soldiers coming off cold guard duty received hot meals immediately, partly for morale but also as genuine medical intervention preventing hypothermia complications. Dental health degraded during winter when diets consisted largely of hard, preserved foods. The Romans couldn't do much about cavities or tooth decay once they started, but they understood that certain foods caused fewer problems. Cheese, now known to help neutralize mouth acids, was considered good for teeth. Soldiers were encouraged to chew fibrous foods that cleaned teeth mechanically. The Roman military valued dental health because soldiers with rotten teeth couldn't eat properly, leading to malnutrition regardless of food availability. Some legions had medical officers with rudimentary dental knowledge who could pull infected teeth or treat abscesses. Mental health, though not understood in modern psychological terms, was recognized as real and important. Romans knew that monotonous diets and endless winter darkness affected morale and mental state. Efforts to provide dietary variety weren't just about nutrition, they were mental health interventions. A surprise ration of wine, a special feast on military holidays, or unexpected fresh meat improved soldiers' psychological state measurably. Modern militaries understand this connection explicitly. Roman commanders learned it through experience, recognizing that small dietary improvements could prevent larger morale problems. The Valetudinarium, or military hospital, maintained special food stores for sick and injured soldiers. These medical rations often included foods unavailable to healthy troops. honey, wine for medical purposes, specific herbs and preparations, and the best preserved foods. Medical officers had authority to requisition additional supplies for patients. This created a perverse incentive where some soldiers might malinger to access better food. Military doctors became skilled at distinguishing genuine illness from creative food-seeking behavior, though the line wasn't always clear. A soldier who was technically healthy but malnourished enough to be ineffective was arguably a legitimate patient. Preventive medicine through nutrition was the Roman military's most effective health strategy. Keeping soldiers adequately fed prevented far more medical problems than could be treated after they developed. This drove the obsessive focus on food supplies and winter preparations. A legion that entered winter well-fed and properly provisioned would lose fewer soldiers to disease than one that scraped by on minimal rations. The math was clear. Invest in food logistics, save money on medical treatment and replacement soldiers. Roman quartermasters and medical officers understood this connection, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern economic terms. With nutrition and medicine addressed, the question remained, how did all these systems actually function in specific historical campaigns? Case studies, real winter campaigns. Historical examples bring Roman winter food logistics from theoretical to practical. Specific campaigns faced unique challenges, and how commanders solved them, or failed to, provides concrete evidence of Roman capabilities and limitations. These case studies show winter feeding systems under actual combat conditions rather than idealized planning documents. Caesar's campaign in Gaul during winter 54-53 BCE became legendary partially because of how badly things went. Multiple legions were scattered in winter quarters across recently conquered territory when local Gauls rebelled. The Eburones tribe, led by Ambiorix, destroyed one Roman legion that tried to march to safety. Supply lines were cut. Multiple forts faced siege conditions without adequate stockpiles. Caesar spent the entire winter conducting relief operations, fighting through snow to resupply besieged garrisons. His accounts describe legions reduced to eating horses and pack animals. The crisis taught Romans hard lessons about dispersed winter camps in hostile territory. Following winters, Caesar concentrated his forces more, ensuring each winter camp had defensive strength and supply reserves to withstand prolonged isolation. The Germanic campaigns under Germanicus in 14 to 16 CE showcased Roman logistics at their most impressive. Operating in forests and swamps where local food was scarce, Roman legions brought virtually everything with them. The Rhine River became a highway, with flotillas of supply ships supporting advancing armies. Winter camps along the Rhine were supplied continuously throughout cold months. Germanicus understood that winning in Germania required solving logistics before tactics. His winter camps resembled small cities with massive horia and organized supply distribution. The campaigns ultimately failed to permanently conquer Germania, but logistics weren't the limiting factor. Roman armies remained well-fed even in some of Europe's harshest winter terrain. The siege of Alesia in 52 BCE presented inverse winter food problems. Caesar besieged Vercingetorix and thousands of Gauls in their fortress, but a Gallic relief army then besieged Caesar's forces. Romans found themselves in a double siege, requiring food for their troops while denying it to enemies on both sides. Winter approached with 3 armies, 2 hostile, 1 Roman, all competing for local food resources. Caesar's solution involved aggressive foraging that stripped the surrounding territory bare, construction of extensive fortifications that prevented Gallic resupply, and iron discipline that maintained Roman supply lines despite enemy pressure. The Gauls inside Alesia eventually expelled their non-combatants, hoping to reduce mouths to feed. Caesar refused to let them through, forcing them back inside and creating a humanitarian disaster that broke Gallic morale. It was ruthless but effective strategy that turned food into a weapon. The Dacian Wars under Trajan, 101 to 102 and 105 to 106 CE, required supplying Roman armies in Carpathian Mountains during brutal winters. The Romans built permanent infrastructure, roads, bridges, and fortified supply depots to support sustained campaigns. Trajan's column in Rome depicts supply trains and logistics operations alongside battle scenes, unusual recognition of logistics importance. Winter quarters in Dacia were elaborately prepared, with massive food stockpiles accumulated during summer campaigns. The archaeological remains of Roman forts in Romania show sophisticated storage facilities and food processing areas. These weren't temporary camps. They were permanent military installations designed for year-round occupation in harsh climate. The Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, while not strictly a winter campaign, demonstrated Roman willingness to wait out enemies through food denial. The siege lasted months, spanning seasonal transitions. Romans maintained supply lines from the coast while starving the city's defenders. Inside Jerusalem, food became more valuable than gold as people fought over scraps. Contemporary accounts describe desperate starvation and even cannibalism among the besieged. Roman legions outside ate relatively normally, supplied through naval routes and local requisitioning. The contrast illustrated that Rome's real military advantage wasn't just legionary training or tactics, it was logistics, the ability to feed armies anywhere for extended periods. The Marcomannic Wars in the 160s to 180s CE pushed Roman winter logistics to their limits. Fighting on the Danube frontier during unstable political periods, Roman armies faced supply challenges while dealing with plague and internal political chaos. Multiple emperors, Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, spent winters in military camps coordinating campaigns. Winter supplies became crucial to maintaining frontier defenses. Archaeological evidence from Danube forts shows expanded storage facilities during this period, indicating Romans were building larger food reserves. The wars dragged on partially because harsh winters forced campaigning pauses, giving enemies time to recover. Roman logistics kept armies in the field, but couldn't overcome the fundamental problem that winter made offensive operations extremely difficult. Agricola's campaigns in Britain, 77 to 84 CE, required adapting Roman logistics to some of the empire's most challenging terrain and weather. Scotland in winter tested every assumption about food supply. Local resources were minimal, the growing season was short, rain and mud were constants. Agricola's solution involved massive stockpiling in southern British bases, then moving supplies north along coastal routes using naval support. Winter camps in Scotland featured enlarged storage facilities proportionally bigger than those in milder climates. The campaigns ultimately withdrew from northernmost territories, partially because maintaining year-round supply lines proved economically impractical. Rome could feed armies anywhere, but the cost-benefit analysis eventually failed in remote Scotland. The Parthian campaigns illustrated winter logistics in completely different environment. Desert winters could be surprisingly cold, and supply challenges were unique. Water replaced food as the primary logistics concern in many areas. Roman armies operating against Parthia learned to time campaigns around seasons, avoiding both summer heat and winter cold extremes. When winter campaigns occurred, they concentrated in river valleys where water and local food were available. The disastrous Parthian campaign under Crassus in 53 BCE failed partially due to supply issues. Later Roman commanders learned from that disaster, ensuring better logistics before venturing into Parthian territory. These case studies demonstrate consistent patterns. Roman commanders who prioritized logistics and prepared for winter succeeded. Those who didn't faced disaster. The Roman military learned institutionally, turning failures into lessons that improved future operations. But they never completely solved winter supply challenges. They just became very good at managing them, which was perhaps the most realistic outcome possible given technological limitations of the ancient world. Roman military success in winter came down to something far less exciting than brilliant tactics or brave soldiers. It came down to quartermaster clerks counting sacks of grain, supply convoys trudging through snow, and soldiers grinding wheat in their tents at the end of exhausting days. The Romans won winter wars by treating food logistics as seriously as combat training, by building infrastructure that supported supply chains, and by maintaining discipline even when everyone was cold, hungry, and miserable. The systems Romans developed, standardized rations, distributed storage, multiple preservation techniques, flexible resupply methods, weren't individually revolutionary. Many cultures used similar approaches, but the Roman genius was systematic implementation across massive distances and diverse territories. A legion in Britain, Germania, or Judea operated on the same logistics principles, making the entire military machine predictable and reliable. This standardization allowed the empire to manage dozens of simultaneous winter garrisons without each requiring unique solutions. Modern militaries still follow principles the Romans established: supply chain management, logistics as a combat multiplier, the recognition that armies march on their stomachs. These concepts trace back to Roman practice. The technology has changed dramatically. Modern armies have refrigeration, air transport, and industrial food production. But the fundamental challenge remains identical: getting food to soldiers in difficult conditions and doing it reliably enough that commanders can focus on their mission rather than survival. The legacy of Roman winter logistics appears in unexpected places. Military rations evolved from hardtack through sea rations to modern MREs, but the concept of preserved, portable, shelf-stable food comes directly from Roman practices. Supply chain management as a business discipline has military roots, including Roman innovations. The idea that professional armies require professional logistics, not improvised scrounging, became standard partially through Roman example. For the soldiers who actually experienced Roman winter quarters, the reality was less impressive than historical accounts suggest. They were cold, often hungry despite best efforts, bored during endless dark months, and probably quite sick of eating the same preserved foods for the 100th day in a row. They complained because soldiers always complain, but they survived. And that survival, multiplied across decades and territories, allowed Rome to maintain military presence in regions where other empires would have collapsed. The question, how did Romans feed their legions during winter, answers itself with systematic, unimpressive competence. They planned carefully, built infrastructure, maintained discipline, adapted to local conditions, and accepted that winter operations were expensive and difficult but necessary. There was no magic solution, no secret technique, just careful work by thousands of people doing unglamorous jobs that kept soldiers alive and effective. which is perhaps the most Roman answer possible, succeeding through organized effort rather than brilliant inspiration, through reliable systems rather than heroic individuals. Winter didn't defeat Roman legions because Roman logistics refused to lose to something as predictable as cold weather and scarce food. The frozen, miserable soldiers standing guard on Germanic frontiers probably didn't appreciate the historical significance of their adequate rations. They just wanted warmer weather and better food. But their ability to remain in position, fed and functional, changed history. Because empires aren't built by heroic battles alone. They're built by logistic systems that work even when everything else is frozen solid. If you're still there, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please support us by simply subscribing and leaving a comment below. See you next time.